writers for British comics who got into comics because we were interested in American comics. It was myself and a guy called Steve Moore, who is still writing for comics, and very, very well as well. And he was very interested in DC and Marvel, and I was very interested in Marvel. And he went to Oddham's Press in London, and they were doing things, they were doing Marvel type magazines like Pow, Smash, Terrific, etc. And I went to IPC, who were doing the very, still sort of old style kind of storytelling, story weeklies like Lion, Valiant, Buster, was a humour magazine, humour comic, things like that. And I was editing a magazine up in Stoke-on-Trent, 6 Downs magazine, and this was a terrible thing. It was all kinds of, it was hunt balls and all kinds of balls. It was dreadful, and I got really fed up with this. And I wrote to IPC and said, basically, here am I, take me. And they were so surprised at someone wanting to go on to the juveniles department that they took me on. And the guy who took me on was a man called Leonard Matthews, who was the head of the department and quite famous. And he took me on because, I suppose, because of my enthusiasm, because he hated people with beards. He had a beard. He also had a Napoleonic complex. And because he had a beard, nobody else in the department must have a beard. I've always had a beard. I've had a beard since 19, and rather shorter than it is now, and rather less white as well. And anyway, he took me on and put me on Lion. And what we were trying to do was sort of infiltrate Steve. I didn't know then, but we compared notes afterwards. And we were basically trying to infiltrate American comic book techniques into British comics. And this was back in the sort of mid-60s, late 60s, 1967, 66, 67, 68. And you could do this in dialogue. So that all of a sudden, the dialogue in Robot Archie and the Spellbinder and stories like that suddenly became more Americanized. And we had a thing in Lion called Adam Eterno, and I was very keen on Robert E. Howard's stuff, Conan the Cimmerian, Conan the Conqueror and all that. And I was getting into Adam Eterno, which I was rewriting. I was rewriting the script, because the guy who wrote the scripts, a man called Ted Coward, was a brilliant storyteller but a lousy dialogue writer. So I was given the job of rewriting the dialogue. And I was having, instead of Adam Eterno saying, "Oh goodness me," he suddenly started to say things like "Crom," "Amra," and stuff like that. And it was terrifically good fun. I thoroughly enjoyed myself. And after a while, you started to realise that there were other people who were interested in the same kind of thing, and the American comics sort of started, you know, we started to get comics conventions. There were a lot of science fiction conventions. You met people and all that. I remember I met Steve Moore. I met Alan Moore as well. That was slightly later, and I went freelance in '75. And I went to live in America for a short while, and a friend of mine is Barry Smith, or Barry Windsor Smith, who started the Conan, the comic for Marvel, with Roy Thomas as writer. And I stayed with him in his apartment, and we used to do things for Conan, you know, on the art side. And I then came back to England, and I was doing a lot of work for various comics. And what happened was Pat and John Wagner, Pat Mills and John Wagner, were then around. I remember they were sort of touted. They were starting to do an awful lot for the girls' papers for IPC, and we online were actually the first comic to give Pat and John a job. And they wrote into various editors saying, here are we, have you got anything to work for us? And they sent in a thing called the Can Do Kids, which we ran in Lion for about, I suppose it was about 9 months, 8 or 9 months. It was terrible. It was very funny, but it was terrible. The artist was a guy called Carlos Cruz, and he's very dull Spanish art, and it was boring stuff. It wasn't the kind of art that grabbed you by the throat. And the thing was, we didn't know how they did things. We used to get the scripts in, and the first, out of a 14-page script, the first 7 pages, the first 7 frames were in one typewriter font, and the last 7 were in that. What happened, Pat and John were doing, what they were doing was, Pat would do the first 7 frames, John would do the second, and then John would take it up for the next instalment, first 7, Pat would take it on after that. And this kind of 2 writers on one story, it was baffling to British comics editors. They didn't know what on earth was going on. And in fact, they got better. They did stuff for other magazines like Valiant, and I can't remember what other ones. But they got to be known, and they started to do an awful lot of work for the girls' papers. And the girls' papers, the girls' stories were quite specialised. I mean, they really were very, very unlike boys' adventure stories, boys' adventure comics. And Pat and John were extremely good at wrenching the heartstrings, which is what you were supposed to do with a girls' comic. And you didn't really need to wrench heartstrings on Lion or Valiant, and they then sort of became known as being people who delivered work, who were able to produce. They kept going, they could produce stuff. Deadlines, they were okay on deadlines, they produced. And I think basically that's how they got really the action gig, because John Sanders wanted to start a new comic, and Pat wanted to start a comic that was quite different to other things, and the whole idea of action came up.
So what were your first impressions of Pat and John Sanders and of the whole idea of action? Were you keen to be involved from the beginning?
Tell me, Duncan, are you going to be interviewing John Sanders?
Probably not. It's very unlikely.
John Sanders. John Sanders was a ball of fire. There were some who thought he was a shit of the first water. But he got things done, and he was very loyal to people who were loyal to him. And when things went down the Swanee with action, he was pretty good. He was very good, in fact. He tried his best. He did his best. But I can't really remember how Pat got in touch with me. You see, he got, for action, he needed an editor who was a hands-on editor. And what he got, he chose a guy called Jeff Kemp. And Jeff Kemp had been my editor on Lion, and Jeff was a very, very good, very cynical, very skeptical man whom basically you had to really pull your finger out to get anything past him.